Recording just started, so hopefully everybody saw that with the recording. You should be able to see my screen now. So attack surface, risks, challenges, and changes. So what we're really going to talk about is what is your attack surface, why it's different, why it's been changing, and what it means in terms of risk and what we see in Unit 42 and why we want you to care about it is really what we're going here. So quick agenda for us. We're going to do some introductions of me so we know who I am. Then we're going to talk about why attack surface matters. And then there is the Unit 42 Attack Surface Management Threat Report. So that report came out, I want to say about 4 months ago. So we're going to talk through some of the results from there, what we see, what is important off of there. We're going to talk about some real world issues, things that are known publicly. I'll talk about some of what we see when we do our analysis, and then some recommendations of takeaways that you can use to help monitor and improve your visibility of your attack surface. So who I am Dominique Kilman. I am a technical director here at Unit 42, like Katie said. I do a lot of our technical assessments using Palo Alto tools and other companies' tools as well. So that's going to be expands for attack surface assessments. Again, we'll talk about that here. I also do compromise assessments. We use multiple different tools on that. And the goal of the work that I do is really looking in detail at the technical data of a company and telling them, here's what the attacker is going to find. Here's how we're going to help prevent those things. And here's maybe things that your users are doing that are increasing risk to your organization. So 20-ish years in computer security. So I've gotten the opportunity to do a lot of different things, starting with, very early days where firewalls were the new hotness. I did malware analysis, a lot of work in EDRs, obviously, lots of big data analytics at this point in time. I do have 2 dogs, so if they start barking, I apologize. I believe they will be quiet today unless somebody comes and knocks on the door, and then we might hear them bark. They are ridiculous. I do love to travel, so you'll see my background here on the call. That was one of my recent trips, and then pictures that I have on Zoom and everywhere else is really about my trips. And then I also have 2 nieces that bring joy to my life. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and it's 2 a.m. Do you know where your infrastructure is? So what that means is IT infrastructure is very complicated. There's a lot going on. So you've got the dev environments, you've got things that need to be accessed remotely, web frameworks, of course, mergers and acquisitions. That leads to some interesting challenges for most of our client environments. There's always the databases. There's always the pure networking and security systems. So your firewalls are part of your attack surface. Your routers, all of those things, those are part of your attack surface, as well as all those tools that we're putting in place to secure them. So your AV is part of your attack surface, your EDRs, your VPNs, all of those. File sharing, most of us have to share data with people. So how do we do that? The problem now is that it's scattered everywhere at this point. So back in the day, back in the old days, right, when I used to work in the government, everything was on-prem. We didn't have to worry about the cloud infrastructure. Everything sat there in our data center. Of course, every once in a while, someone would buy a server and plug it into the network, but it was still located within our network and our control. So we had that hard perimeter that we could work with. At this point, that is no longer an option. So remote work, obviously accelerated by COVID, but it was happening anyway, that people were working remotely. There is this desire to bring the data to the people instead of bringing people to the data. Much less expensive, but also increases risk that you're obviously putting that data in and out of systems that you don't have control over. Shadow and rogue IT has always been a problem. It's just exacerbated with the scattered surface where you don't have that one network that you can look in. And then digital transformation, SASE and cloud, and all of the apps that we need to make data available to people externally. In addition to that, you've also got other things in your attack surface. So there's the assets owned by you. We're good with those. There is on-prem assets. We're really pretty good with those too. So we know where they sit and what they're doing. cloud environments, there's a lot of managed cloud environments that you've got, but then you've also got these unsanctioned cloud environments over here. So, we're going to see unsanctioned cloud assets because people have access to the cloud and they might just bring something up that you don't know about. Internally facing assets becomes a really interesting challenge when you have a lot of people working remotely, but maybe they don't have the same security controls that you would have in place if they were sitting in your offices. And then supply chain assets. Supply chain is becoming a bigger and bigger risk. I'm sure you guys are aware of that. We see that day in and day out, that we're getting calls from clients saying, we just got notified that one of our partners got infected. Can you help us? Can you help work and figure out, are we impacted by the fact that they got compromised? So all of this leads to a pretty big challenge for the security operations team. Limited attack surface visibility. So with all of these things, all of the data that we talked about on the previous slide, can you find all of your assets? Asset management has been one of the key things we've been harping on for 20 years. It is still a challenge, and it's always going to be a challenge because it is so easy for new assets to be in your environment that you're not aware of. Unclear risk prioritization. Do you know where the risk is? And do you know where to focus your efforts? Because you're not going to be able to fix everything unless you've got a giant security team. So you're going to have to prioritize which risk that we look into, which things do we patch, which patch is the most important, and which services do we actually have to be monitoring very, very closely, and which are the ones that we just need to be aware of. And then difficulty to act on those security alerts. If you do get alert of a new cloud device, do you know what to do at that point if you see that? While all of this is going on, so you as the security operations team, you've got a lot of work to do, and attackers use automation. So they're looking at all of this, they're aware of all these things in the environment, and on average, there is a new serious public exposure every 12 hours. So something is going on roughly every 12 hours that the attackers have found this information, but the defenders may not know. There's also the issue of vulnerabilities. The rate of vulnerabilities being found is not going down, and it probably won't go down anytime soon. Attackers are very, very good at taking that and exploiting it very quickly. And then, the third thing is, attackers often know more about your infrastructure than you do. So we used to say this back when we would come in as consulting and we would do a pen test. We'll probably know your environment better than you do. Attackers feel the same way. They probably know your environment better than you do because they don't have those 5 other jobs that you have as a security defender. They can just sit there and target and look for exposures. So all of this leads to large numbers of challenges for your teams, of course. So we talked about some of this, the limited visibility, unable to quickly react, 0 days, a little bit of a misnomer because once we find out about them, it's no longer a 0 day, but we need to be able to react at the speed of machine as opposed to the speed of a person. So the more we can enable automation across all of our environments, attackers are doing it, we need to catch up with them. And then back to asset management, say we did find it. Are we going to be okay to say, I'm going to shut down the firewall port to X, Y, and Z that was exposing Telnet, for example? There is risks to automatically shutting down anything. There's risks to leaving it all open. So that's where we come into that entire issue with attack surface visibility, prioritization, what we can and cannot do, because you have to follow your governance standards. An attacker couldn't care less about your governance standards, so they can take things down willy-nilly, and you actually have to go through all your processes and procedures. So these are the challenges that your team is going to face, and preaching to the choir, I know you're aware of all of these, but the idea here is to help you convey those risks to other people. So you don't always have the either the slides or the language to be able to convey this risk to the people that can help you make those changes. So this is why our attack surface matters. This is why our attack surface is a challenge, because our attackers know it and we don't know it as well. So next up, we're going to go through and look at what we found during Unit 42 analysis. So what we did is we took the data from last year. So looking at data from last year using a combination of our Expanse scanning tools and the Unit 42 consulting team, where we work on incident response and we work on proactive engagements, such as telling people what their attack surface looks like. And the data that we're going to show is over about 250 customers. So we're going to show you what we found when we looked at all of that data. The report is available on the Unit 42 Palo Alto Network's website. You can always go get that report. There's a summary of the report as well. And then you'll be able to see these slides that have different excerpts from that particular report. So really, we're going to go down the path of what do we have and where is it? So looking at what we have, most of what we're seeing in the environment is web framework issues. So that's almost a quarter of what we saw in the environment is insecure web configurations and insecure versions of those web services. So we harp on Apache. I have not done an attack surface assessment using Expanse where there weren't vulnerable versions of Apache web servers. And Apache is a big target for everybody. They have lots of vulnerabilities and they have lots of actually critical vulnerabilities. So that's one of the things that we see a whole lot. PHP as well. The interesting part about PHP is I see vulnerable PHP in most of my environments. PHP is less exploited, which is very interesting to us when we look at those CVEs. Look at what those public exploits are available for PHP. It is interestingly much lower. Insecure versions of jQuery, also one of the ones we see in almost every environment that I have looked in. Remote access services, 20% of the exposures. And in this case, we're not just talking about RDP, while RDP will be a bit of a focus in a little bit here, but this is also SSH or VNC. Sometimes it's actually TeamViewer. So a lot of the times we're seeing SSH. When we go and look at it, we try and validate, is it wide open SSH? Or is there something where I need a certificate on my machine to be able to remote in? We also see web-based RDP. So all of those things, attackers are going to see them, they're going to find them, and then they're going to try and brute force credentials. IT and networking infrastructure is the next one down over here. Most of the time, what we see is it looks like exposed developer environments. So we're looking at what type of information is in there. We're looking at certificates, things like that. And then we go back and say, you know, what is this site and should it be up? We also see point-to-point tunneling. We see the login pages for routers and firewalls. We always suggest I should not be able to get to your Cisco router login page. Again, it's going to be subject to brute force. Other things that we see, you know, file sharing, that's FTP, SFTP. Database exposures are a pretty big risk that I see in my environment, mostly because a customer doesn't realize that they have that in there. And then end of life, a lot of this also comes back to the same web frameworks that we were talking about. So we will see end of life Apache out there. We will see end of life WordPress. So those are some of the things that kind of cross over between a couple of different issues, web frameworks, and then unpatched or misconfigured. So that's what we saw across the organizations. Pretty good statistics of what we see in general. So what an attacker sees. Attacker is going to go and look at the same thing and some graphics of what we see. So scan of the internet, really easy mass scan or zgraph scan. You can find all of this information. What are attackers scanning for most often? Easy access. So they're going to look for telnet. They're going to look for SSH. They're going to look for RDP. And then they're also going to start looking for those admin ports. So most of what we see attackers scanning for when they're looking for open ports is these easy remote access. And it takes them, you know, maybe 45 minutes to scan the internet at this point. So it's very quick for them to find this information, and they don't have to follow any of those rules. So maybe Nmap comes back and says, technically you shouldn't be scanning the entire internet. Terms of service, those types of things, attackers don't care about that. So they're just going to keep scanning everything in the internet for as much time as they want to. Moving over into some of what we see when we're doing actual investigations. So this is from last year's incident response report. So in that investigation, by far the largest entry point that we see is actually software vulnerabilities. Brute force credentials with RDP, also a really big target. RDP is almost always the biggest target. When we see compromise, we're seeing it entry with RDP. But the interesting part of that software vulnerability and exploits, most of what we saw in those exploits, it really focused on about 4 key CVEs. So getting back to the idea of you don't have to patch everything. Ideally, of course, we would love for you to patch everything, and we would love to have an environment where you could patch everything. But that is not the reality that any of us live in. So focusing in on which vulnerabilities are the most likely to be exploited based on what type of exploit it is. Is it a remote code execution? Is it data leakage, those types of things, and how many exploits are available and how likely is it for that to be exploited. Some other interesting things, this was particularly in ransomware, 28 days of dwell time. So while we also often think that, you know, they ransomware, they get in, they start encrypting things really quickly, and then they try and get their money. Surprisingly, they are staying a longer time than what the assumption is. So they're kind of hanging out in there, moving around the environment as much as they can. And a lot of it is they're stealing data as well. And yes, the slide deck will be available. So moving around in that, there's a lot of abuse of trusted relationships, and then RDP is the most prevalent. Over 40% of the remote access services that we see is actually basic remote desktop protocol. And from the report that we looked at, 85% of organizations that we looked at had RDP exposed at some point during the month. And what that tells us is that RDP isn't often exposed on purpose. There's a lot of accidental exposures of that. So what do you do about that? You find a tool that gives you that information. So we are Palo Alto Networks. I'm going to talk Palo Alto Networks things. We have our tool called Expanse, and we absolutely love Expanse. Day in and day out, I spend a lot of my time here and looking at, in our case, we call them incidents, but there's rules out there. And one of our favorite rules is tell me where the RDP servers are. Tell me where the telnet servers are. So I can easily go into my environment and I can say, what do I have? If it's something like RDP, I can set up alerting to tell me. As soon as you see RDP, send me an alert to my security team and let me know. Or I can go a step further and say, you know what, Expanse, you've got ways to fix this for me. I'm going to let you automatically fix that issue for me. My team in consulting, we don't automatically fix things for people because we don't want to change a client environment without them knowing what's going on. But again, absolutely, there are tools out there that will do this scanning for you. They're continuously scanning and they'll let you know, here's the thing, here's the risk, here's where you need to focus your time. Moving over into critical vulnerabilities. So I talked about the fact that most of the IRs that we see are coming in from vulnerabilities. We took 30 CVEs from May 2022 to May 2023. 3 of them, so you'll see 3 of them up here, they were actually exploited within 1 week. So CVE is published 1 week and there is an active exploit, and we see clients actively being exploited with these. 19 of these 30, so more than half of them are being exploited within 12 weeks. So you'll see this graphic, it talks about the first dot is when the CVE was published, and then the second dot here is when we saw the exploits. So you can see some of them are pretty long. You can see April was a pretty rough month right there of looking at how quickly those 3 CVEs got exploited, and those were all in April. Another one that we focused on here is we said, well, let's just look at remote code execution. What happens with those very specific types of vulnerabilities? We looked at 15 of those. 3 of them were exploited within hours of disclosure. So at this point, attackers are a lot faster. And as an organization, trying to figure out what do I do about that and how do I figure that out as quickly as an attacker figured it out, that's one of the really big challenges. So 6 of them exploited within 8 weeks. Obviously some are a little bit longer, but the really concerning part here is, what do I do with things in hours? So a lot of what you're going to do is you're going to monitor, you're going to patch as quickly as you can, you're going to find those different mitigation strategies, using a tool that can automatically do that for you. So again, you're not waiting for the human in the loop to do all of these things. You're doing as much as you can to prevent the attackers from seeing them. And so we talked about it a little bit right here, but roughly takes 45 minutes to scan the internet. With the tools that exist now, the automations and all of those things in place, 45 minutes. And then 5 minutes if you're just scanning for a very specific CVE. So attackers are starting very quickly. They're monitoring all this and they're seeing it as soon as possible. And they're like, ooh, look, a new P0. Let me scan for the entire internet and find where I can exploit this. A little bit of story time in here. We'll look at what Hafnium did. So this was from 2020. But what we saw in 2020 is there were actually two exploits that happened here, or 2 CVEs that happened here. So December 10th, the first CVE was identified, and then on December 30th, there was another CVE identified, and this was the proxy login issues. The day after that second vulnerability was identified, there was a proof of concept. So DevCon created a proof of concept. It was a working model for these 2 CVEs. By January 3rd, active exploits were happening. So people were seeing this actively being exploited. So we're at 3 days. If you dig into this particular image right here, you can actually find that we talked about the CVE coming out December 30th. The actual security patch for this didn't come in until March the next year. So everybody was vulnerable for a good 3 months on this. There were some mitigations and things like that. But again, you've got 3 months of being vulnerable. You need to know if someone's scanning you. You need to know, do I actually even have that product? Do I have that version? How much do I need to care about this? So again, we come back to having a tool that lets you know that based on what it knows about your environment. So CVEs get published, rules go out in place to say, here's how I find it, here's how I detect it. When you've got a tool out there that's monitoring your attack surface, you can get those notifications and you can say, all right, so here's the CVE. Or maybe you just come back to say, do I even have Confluence in my network? So maybe you're just looking for rules to tell you what products you have in the environment. And then if there is an exploit, let me know if I've got that version. So again, having that tool that does this work for you, so you don't have to go in and manually trigger a scan. The scan is already happening. So this is really what you want in your environment. Next in, we're gonna talk about cloud. Cloud is a great thing. I love the cloud. It has so many fun things. It does so many good things for us. but it increases our risk a lot. One of the things that we found is how dynamic the cloud is. So what we're seeing is 20% on average, somewhat depends on the industry that we're talking about, but 20% of those services are changing month over month. So it's not at all a static environment. So you have to continuously monitor all right, I got a new cloud thing. Is that my cloud thing? Is that somebody that's pretending to be my cloud? Is that something that accidentally got published publicly? So lots of that going on. So the greatest risk that we see, so we're looking at all of those exposures, 80% of them are in the cloud. So your cloud environment is actually fairly exposed, and 45% of those high risk exposures were on those new services. So again, we're talking about that 20% new services accounting for over half or almost half of the vulnerabilities and exposures that you see. And that's just because it's so easy to put something out that doesn't have your full configuration and lack of visibility. Cloud is always connected to the internet. So making sure that you know what that cloud is, who has it, and who can actually take things in and out. So cloud environments, being able to monitor for that, being able to tie that into your other security controls. There are tools out there. Wiz is one of them, Prisma Cloud is one of them, of course, that helps you manage your cloud assets. Being able to use that to say, here's my managed cloud assets, taking that back to an attack surface management tool as well to say, here's my known cloud assets. Let me know if something unknown ever pops up, just so you can go and look at that and say, hey, who put this new Azure service out there? What's going on here? Let me know what's going on so you can figure out how to mitigate that type of risk. All right, some real world examples. We'll go through some of these of what we saw in different environments. All of this is public information, so we're not sharing any secrets from anybody, but some real world cases that happened. So misconfigured AWS S3 buckets. Right back to that cloud environment that we were talking about. So this happened to be from a prison. So inmate records were exposed, and it was a misconfiguration on an AWS S3 bucket. We don't see this a ton when we're doing attack surface assessments, but absolutely this is a critical finding that we see a misconfigured S3 bucket, that we would very quickly go back saying, hey, this is actual real data. We need to figure out who owns this. We need to figure out how to lock it down. And then we're also going to have to go and figure out, did anyone else see it before we were able to see it? So huge risk of exposing sensitive data, because cloud containers are exposed, cloud data is exposed, and usually it's just an easy mistake that someone forgot to flip one switch. RDP honeypot. So there's a set of researchers at Go Secure. They put up an RDP honeypot. It was not well secured, but it was a honeypot. It was intended to collect this information. So between July 1st and September 30th of 2022, 3.5 million login events. So this just tells you in 3 months, that many login attempts, 1,500 IP addresses that they actually saw login attempts from. So it was from all over the place. Most common thing, administrator. Of course, we're gonna try the administrator accounts first. So you can see some of these login attempts, the first set here, those look like pretty generic. It's just a random scanning environment. But these ones where we've got the arrows next to them, those were actually much more targeted. So those usernames were related to the certificate, the host, and the hosting on the host and the hosting provider. So in those cases, someone was doing real research to look at that and say, let me see if I can find something that is targeted towards this environment. So lots of stuff. They also gave us a count for an entire year, 13 million login attempts. Really neat report to look at. Some of the information that they also found when they were looking at the timeliness of those scans, it was very obvious that some of those scans were done from a business perspective. And what I mean there is that you could see the scanning coming from unique IPs or from a specific IP. And you could see where they were taking breaks. So they went to lunch and then they had off hours. So it was only during work hours. They weren't scanning over the weekends. So interesting to see that it's some of those IPs are being scanned as a business, as opposed to just your general scanners that we have, of course, or the what you think of as the hacker hanging out as a criminal doing things in their mom's basement. I know that's old school, but it really is a business for people to find this information. GitHub code repositories. This is a pretty rough one. So we do like GitHub. It's a great code repository, but it's not always well protected. So some of us, we have internal GitHub repositories, but things are being leaked in those repositories. And sometimes the leaks are in that it is your code base. So we saw some of those out there, but it could also be a little bit more innocuous in that maybe you were using a key within a public GitHub repository that an attacker could use to access something internally. So figuring out where are our GitHub repos, who owns them, can I take it offline? What happens when I take it offline? All of that information has to be monitored to make sure that you're not accidentally releasing information. The same with the next one we're going to look at is database leakage. So databases being exposed. How do you know it's you? So that's one of the things when we're doing ransomware incidents, actually. So the attacker is going to put information up there and say, I've got all of your patient records, assuming you're a hospital, I've got all of your patient records from the past 4 years. And they post a screenshot of a database. Can you tell that that is your data? Can you tell that it's legitimate data? And could you be able to identify where it came from? So some of that is knowing what data is exposed. Some of that is knowing how do I find my own data? So if I got this list of account names, would I be able to quickly validate that it was mine and the attacker's not lying to me? And what do I do with that? Let me see where it ran in the system. So again, exposed databases, obviously a hugely critical issue on that. But again, it comes back to ransomware as well. If they got into your environment, would you be able to tell that it was your data? So understanding where that part of your attack surface lies, and that's more of an internal issue here of knowing what my data is, where it sits, and how can I quickly validate it. And the last story I'm gonna talk about is it's not you, it's them. As talking earlier, we have a lot of these come in where they say my partner company got ransomware. I don't know how they connect to my environment. Am I at risk? Now I need you to go do an entire assessment of my internal environment because they could have infected me. Knowing how are they connecting to you? Do you have any insight into their attack surface? So if you're doing, say, a merger and acquisition, or you're onboarding a new partner, do you have the ability to go see, well, do they have RDP exposed? And if they have RDP exposed, is that then going to expose me because they've now got an account into my system and an attacker was able to move from my partner through our internal connections, our B2B connections, and infect my environment. So there's a lot of being aware of who else has entry into your environment that you absolutely have no control over. So some of what we do in our monitoring is, co-located and looking at how other environments connect back to you. So we will go ahead and look at those rules when we're doing assessments to say, hey, you know what? Here's everything that we see, and here's the accounts that you're sharing, and here's when they last logged in, and here's where we see them breach. So there's also that other side of it where you have to look at everybody else that you allowed entry into your environment. So that's some of our stories from the trenches of different things that we've seen where the attack surface did start to become more and more critical, and it's not going to stop. This is just going to keep expanding and you're going to keep having to deal with these issues. So last thing that we're going to talk about is, what am I supposed to do about it? You told me lots of problems, you told me lots of things you found. So now what am I going to do? So the first thing you're going to do is gain visibility. Step one is finding a way to scan your environments so you know what you have. I said Expanse helps. Expanse is great for me. I love this. But it's not the only tool in the environment. You may have some tools that already do this for you. So maybe you already have some vulnerability scanning, but you need to make sure that when you're doing this, you're not scanning just for what you know about. You're scanning for what the internet might know about. So that's where all these attack surface management tools come into play, in that we're not just going to stop at the mycompany.com. We're going to say mycompany.com, but let me see if there's anything else that uses your domain name. Let me see if there's any certificates. Let me see if there's other IP addresses. So you have to make sure that you're looking at the broader area, because that's how you're going to find the unknowns in your environment. Securing remote access services. Again, we talk about RDP, we talk about SSH, MFA. MFA has been a thing for multiple years now, and it is still not as prevalent as we would want it to be. So there are still a lot of environments where it's just a username and password, and people are who they are, and we reuse passwords. People use bad passwords. So the more you can use something like multi-factor authentication, it is not the silver bullet that fixes everything. There are attacks with MFA. However, it is one more blocker for attackers to be able to easily get in. Sorry, my words got away from me there on that one. So one more hurdle that an attacker will have to go through. Prioritizing remediations. What's the most critical thing? CVSS score, that helps us a lot. EPSS score, this is first.org. It's the exploit probability score. How likely do we think that that CVE is going to be exploited? And that's where we suggest focusing as much of your energy as you can. So once we get rid of those, high and critical CVEs and the ones that we think are going to be exploited, we can of course move on to patching the other things, but focus on something absolutely about to be exploited first and foremost. Addressing cloud configuration issues, using a cloud management tool. So knowing about your cloud with your attack surface scanning, and then having a tool that lets you manage that cloud. Making sure that you've got standard policies, making sure you have a way to monitor that those policies are being applied correctly. And then the last one we're going to give you is monitor for emerging threats. There's a lot of things to look at in the world. So having a tool that tells you that. So I showed the screenshot of Expanse that has that, that threat page where you can look at those threat pages. Lots of your different security tools are going to have that. Making sure that you're monitoring that, making sure you're getting updates from that. The Unit 42 blog, that's going to have our insights. It's also going to give you the capabilities when we're searching for stuff. Here's how we search for it in our tools. But making sure you have those relationships with your vendors. So we're keeping you up to date with what we know. And then as well as looking at more of those public resources. All right, so I do have one question in the chat, and then we're going to open it up for other questions. So the question in chat is for on-prem infrastructure. The Cortex Expanse report doesn't really seem any different than the external vulnerability scan that they run daily. So yes, the external vulnerability report that you run daily, very good. I'm glad that you're doing that. Expanse does more than just a straight up vulnerability scan. So I talked a lot about vulnerabilities, but we're also looking at open ports that are maybe a different kind of risk. So is it, telnet on port 2020? So we'll find those types of things. Some of your scanners will do that as well. So there's a difference. It's not just a vulnerability scan, but if you're thinking maybe is it an Nmap scan, is it similar to what an Nmap scan does? Somewhat similar, yes, but we have more tailored rules. So our rules are going to be able to be tailored a little bit better. And then you can change what you feel about your risk. So if you're aware that you've got, say, unsecured FTP, maybe you have to do that. That's a possibility that you have to do that. You can actually change the risk score evaluation in there. And then the other thing that Expanse is going to give you as well is continuous scanning. So it's going to do this on the back end. You don't have to kick anything off. You're going to get reports out of it. And then there's also the ability to do remediation based on what you see. So there are additional features of that. Is Expanse comparable to Recorded Future? It is comparable, but I work for Palo Alto, so ours is better, of course. That's always going to be the answer. I don't have a ton of experience with Recorded Future personally, so I don't want to say a whole lot about that one. I do know that there's some comparisons on the Palo Alto website talking about what Expanse does versus other tools out there. But I personally do not have enough experience with that tool to say what it does that we do or don't do and how they do it differently. All right. Any other questions out there? So we will have the slides up there. You will have the links to both the attack surface threat report as well as the Unit 42 blog. So that's going to have links to other reports if you are interested in them. If you ever want to talk to us, we're happy to talk to people. Like I said, I love looking at attack surfaces and helping clients figure out where to focus their energies to make them as secure as we can be. That's my contact information. If you've ever got questions to me, and then of course, wider Palo Alto, everybody is happy to talk to you. Okay. So Katie, I might be done here.